Which low-price player allows us to play a stud this week? I'm here with John Lee and Phil Alexander, who's filling in for Devin Knotts. Before we get to the plays, which are going to be interesting this week, because where on earth is the value? Let's start with John Lee, who takes us to Vegas every single week. John, please kick us off.
Yeah, interesting week this week. We've got Buffalo hosting the Cleveland Browns. They're calling, I think, for 70 inches of snow in Buffalo. So today we got word that they're headed out to Detroit to play that game. So Buffalo no longer has home field advantage. Nonetheless, that game has a 48.5 points total in Vegas. Buffalo heavy favorites at 8.5 points. So they've got a 28.5 points team total, which is highest on the board this week. Just below Buffalo, you got the Baltimore Ravens going up against the Carolina Panthers, who I believe, I'd have to look it up to be sure, but I believe Carolina actually has the lowest implied team total for the whole season. So we're in week 11. They're right at 14 points.
When I looked at it, John, I thought it might be the lowest ever since we've started the show.
I'm pretty sure.
It's obscene.
Yeah, I've been doing this Vegas value chart for a few years now. I think I've seen as low as like 12 and a half. Okay. So it has been worse, but not much worse. The Baltimore Ravens defense are obviously the kind of the creme de la creme this week, and you're going to pay for them. We'll get there eventually. The game is interesting. You got two offenses that are, questionable. One has the hottest quarterback in the league. That's Justin Fields. We talked about him last week for cash games. He was the answer there and in GPPs. Dude had a tremendous game for the second week in a row, and this week he gets the Atlanta Falcons on the road. That is the highest Vegas total on the board, 49.5 points. I think the bigger question there is, do you take the home favorites, Atlanta Falcons, who have a 26.3 implied team total? After that, one more game kind of looks interesting. Dallas heading up to Minnesota. You've got the Minnesota Vikings are at this point, living high after probably the best game of the year for at least from sheer entertainment value last week, beating the Buffalo Bills, right? I'm not wrong on that. It's Buffalo.
Correct.
Beat Buffalo. They're hosting Dallas, and Dallas is a short away favorites at 1.5 points. That game could go back and forth with two pretty decent offenses. So, from an entertainment perspective and Vegas, it looks pretty good. I mean, we're missing the game I would love to play, and the game I'll definitely be doing some showdown is that. I think that's a Sunday night game, Kansas
Correct.
City and the Chargers, Herbert versus Pat Mahomes. But, on this show, we only talk about the main slate. And so, we'll focus in on those games today.
Yeah, so it is an interesting slate, and we're going to get really deep into the construction here. And you're going to notice throughout the show that the players we recommend are not super high priced or super low priced, just based on how the slate is working out. And so I'm going to challenge the guys here to, and these are two GPP guys. So they're going to talk about those high and low players to play in GPPs because everyone else is playing the middle plays based on how the pricing in the slate works. And so we're going to talk to the guys about, make sure we're clear on the format as always. But Phil, why don't you kick us off with quarterbacks? And I think you may start with a particularly piping hot quarterback. Despite his price going up, he still seems like the way to go. And if there's anyone else besides, spoiler, it's Justin Fields, then please fill us in. So why Fields this week with his rising price tag? Because I think that's who we're probably going to say. And then anyone else that you like.
Yeah, he's the fourth most expensive quarterback on the slate now, which is a big difference, as you alluded to, from the mid-5 to 6K range where he's been just an absolute smash over the last couple of weeks. But you can't argue with 178 and 147 rushing yards in each of his last two games. It actually sounds absurd to say it out loud. In cash games, what's his median rushing projection? 75 yards. He's starting out with a 1x multiple. You really can't beat it. You have to keep playing him, especially in a dome, and especially against the Falcons. I think that Fields is once again the way to go for cash. The only other route that I could see an argument for, but I'll try to make it, but it's not a very good one, might be Daniel Jones at 5,700.
Yeah.
You could feel pretty good about 3X on a $5,700 salary this week with Daniel Jones against the Lions. They've allowed the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks for the season. For the last 5 weeks, they're just bad. They've been bad the whole way through. The only reason I wouldn't do it is because you need to have more than 3X in your range of potential outcomes. When your opponents are playing a guy, or most of your opponents are playing a guy that could rush for 180 yards in any given week, and Jones has only gone over 21 DraftKings points in one game out of 10. So the floor is there. I think you could play him, but I think that you run the risk of just getting boat raced by the Justin Fields teams again.
Yeah, I mean, that $1,900 makes a big difference, though. But yeah, I mean, Fields hasn't had fewer than 47 rushing yards since week 2. So, think about that. John, what are your thoughts at the quarterback position? And is it Fields for you as well? Is it a slam dunk? And then I do have a Fields question to ask you guys after, since it seems like that's the way we're all going.
I mean, I don't want to waste a lot of time. I had almost the same commentary that Phil has. Go with Fields if you can afford him, for all the reasons he said. I mean, for what it's worth, Daniel Jones runs a lot too.
He does
in the world of quarterbacks, but he's not running the way that Justin Fields is. I mean, look at Daniel Jones had 5 rushes last time, 6 before that, 11, 6, 10. But not 14, 15. It's like you're getting a running back that also throws for a couple thousand more, also going up against a very bad defense. So if you can get there, I think that's the way to go. But, the lower end is the Daniel Jones option. And like you said, you're going to be probably going up against, my guess is it'll be, we'll see what value opens up tomorrow, being Friday with injury reports. But if no value opens up, you're probably up against 60%, 65% Justin Fields, 25% Daniel Jones, and then 10% of people who don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, and in case the viewers can't tell, or if you guys couldn't tell, my internet just froze for about 35 seconds. So I'm sure John extolled the virtues of Justin Fields even more. And so I think of Daniel Jones and I think of Justin Fields, and someone should do this meme, right? Where the run of Daniel Jones against Philly a couple years ago, where he broke free, right? And then have him chasing like $1,900, and then he falls down at the 10-yard line and the $1,900 scores. Like that's him versus Justin Fields at this point. So the only issue that I can think of with playing Fields, and this is hard, like you're just searching for warts at this point, would be, can Atlanta play so slow? Is this game going to really go back and forth? Atlanta has had there's so many weeks this year where they've had a top 3 game total in a game. And they're a team that throws, they've thrown 14 times a game, like 3 times this year. So should that team be deserving of a 48.5 point total? And what if they just take the air out of the ball? I guess that'd be my only objection, but it's admittedly, it's a pretty hard one to make. So Phil, and excuse me if John already answered this during my frozen period, who are you going with in GPPs to get away from the Justin Fields?
Sure. The one thing that I would say to your concern is that the Falcons can run the ball on the Bears. The Bears are a little bit of a run funnel. So even though they're going to be running and the Bears are going to be running, that game could still very well get there just because one can't stop the other.
Sure.
So I'm not overly concerned about the potential for the Falcons, kind of taking the air out of the ball, like you said. GPPs, I think I'm most likely, using a high-priced quarterback in the majority of my lineups because, well, first of all, I'm playing Fields and GPPs this week. I've made the terrible mistake of leaving him out of my lineups because he was going to be so over-leveraged by the field. And all I've done is gotten smoked by the field in the last couple of weeks. So I'm keeping a couple of lineups reserved for Fields. He's obviously got the ceiling that we need, and we could look to get different around him in a couple of spots. But in GPPs, I think I'm mostly going to be spending up at quarterback to the 8K range with Hurts, Allen, Lamar Jackson. I think those guys have a similar likelihood of just wrecking the slate as Fields, but probably with the exception of Josh Allen, who I think is now going to get very popular, that game is moving to Detroit and into a dome. I think those other guys will probably go off at like half of Fields ownership. So I'll probably be looking to do that. And I do like the Minnesota-Dallas game that John mentioned. So I'll probably be doing some things with those quarterbacks as well.
Okay. Yeah, of course, those are good calls too. John, do you have any other quarterback calls to make, or do you want to save those for your wide receiver section, since we know that's what drives your quarterback play?
I mean, I'll give you one now. I mean, there's a couple wide receivers that are driving some of those, but what do you guys think about the return of Matt Ryan? Return of Matt Ryan, I don't know. He scored probably 9, 13, 23, 24 fantasy points last week, and kind of a surprise start against the Las Vegas Raiders. This week he goes up against a Philadelphia team that's playing on a short week off a disappointing loss to the Washington Commanders. And, he's got some decent receivers there. I kind of like Matt Ryan this week. He's how much is he? 5,200.
Yeah.
I like what he does in terms of my roster build because his receivers are cheap. We'll get there, but Michael Pittman's 6,100. Paris Campbell's 4,300. And what that does, it allows you to go high elsewhere. And you already talked, Ryan, about the roster build this week. You're going to see a lot of people going kind of that middle, 55 to 7,500 range. And going low at quarterback and low at wide receiver allows you to kind of differentiate yourself from a roster build perspective for GPPs. So I kind of do like that play, and maybe I'll stop there because there's some other guys, but I'll mention them at the wide receiver position. Yeah,
the hard part for me, and the logic is sound. I'm not going to be Devin and just poo-poo your pick because Matt Ryan's 47 years old and a stiff. Albeit that was my first instinct. He's not going to get you 10 points rushing every week like he did last. I mean, he threw for 222 and a touchdown last week. That said, I mean, Philly's stats against quarterbacks look really great, but I mean, in descending order here are the last few they've played. Taylor Heineke, Davis Mills, Kenny Pickett, Cooper Rush, Kyler Murray, Trevor Lawrence are the best quarterbacks that they have played. So is Philly's pass defense that good? Darius Slay and company are good players, but they really haven't faced a murderer's row of opponents either. That said, Matt Ryan doesn't belong on any Mount Rushmores at this point in his career either. But I do see just from a build perspective, I see what you're going for. Albeit I'm not brave enough to do it. So with that said, let's move on to running backs. And John, why don't you kick us off there at the running back position? I think, again, we talked a little bit. We're looking at middling running backs, right? So tell us who your guys are, and if you have anybody that's not, if I'm incorrect, tell me who your high end guys are too.
Yeah, I mean, there's two guys clearly at the top of the list for me. Dameon Pierce, Houston, going up against Washington. He's 6,500. I don't know what he was last week, but I feel like he was about that last week. And 6,300. So they raised his price $200. Last week he touched the ball 19 times, had 122 yards combined. He didn't score a touchdown. I guess that was the big thing. For what it's worth, he didn't score a touchdown the week prior when he touched it 27 times. I want to say in tournaments last week, he was in the neighborhood of 40% rostered. he's going to be a guy that's heavily rostered again this week. In cash games, you're probably looking at close to 50, 60%. Next to him, and very close, is Ramondre Stevenson for New England. He's going up against the Jets, a team that the Patriots shouldn't have beaten the last time out. There were some silly plays there, but Jets, they jetted themselves. Ramondre is being used
Sorry,
similarly.
Phil.
What's that?
I said sorry, Phil.
Sorry, Phil. Yeah, sorry.
I'm used to it. Don't worry. Rolls right off these days.
Yeah. So in the past, I don't know, 5 games, he's probably averaging, estimating in my head somewhere 22 to 23 touches a game. I know that Ryan was talking about prior to the show that Dameon Harris is supposed to return this week, but I really don't think it makes a big difference because in 2 of those games, Harris was present and he was still getting that type of volume. So those are the 2 big guys, 6,500, 6,700. And then, I think an argument can be made for David Montgomery there in Chicago. The question is whether or not you can actually, if you're comfortable taking 2 Chicago Bears in your cash game lineups. And for that answer, I know Phil's been thinking about it because he asked that earlier today. So, Phil, where did you land? Can you do it?
Well, the placeholder lineup that I have in right now says that I can. I have Stevenson and Montgomery as my 2 running backs. I almost feel like Montgomery would have to try not to score 15 fantasy points in this one against the Falcons, regardless of what else is going on in the absence of Khalil Herbert. So, yeah, I guess I'm playing him. Don't feel great about it. I don't feel great about it.
All right.
And that's your and that's your Montgomery testimony from Phil Alexander, folks. Stevenson played touches week 9, 18 touches, week 8 versus the Jets, 23, week 7 versus Chicago, 19, week 6 at Cleveland, 23.
Did we lose him?
I think we might have.
All right. Well, let's talk while we're waiting on him to come back. Let's talk a little bit about Josh Jacobs. Are you back, Ryan?
Oh yeah, I'm here. Did I freeze again?
You froze again.
Golly, what a night. Sorry, folks. I was just reeling off the Ramondre Stevenson touches conversation. In short, they're plenty, and Dameon Harris hasn't missed every game where he had plenty. Yeah, Josh Jacobs was somebody I did want to talk about. Thanks, John. The price tag is up, but the role is also, I think, still there. He's not exactly on fire anymore like he was this time a month ago. So what are you guys doing there? Phil, hit us.
He's definitely in my player pool for tournaments. I think that there's definitely a good enough chance that he could potentially lead the position in scoring this week. So I don't mind him. I think he's fine, but I think he's kind of in a group for me in tournaments where I'm going to be kind of equal on him, Saquon Barkley, Kamara. I think that we've got to wait and see what happens with Ezekiel Elliott, because otherwise Tony Pollard would definitely shoot towards the very top of my list for all formats. One guy for tournaments, and I had mentioned this earlier, that Chicago is a bit of a run funnel. I think that Cordarrelle Patterson is an interesting play this week because the field is going to be off of him because he just busted in a nationally televised game on Thursday night with 5 carries for 18 yards. But it was a short turnaround for Patterson in his first game off of IR, and I think Atlanta didn't want to push him. And now that he's had a long rest and they're kind of facing a must-win game to stay in the race in that terrible NFC South, I think that this might be the type of place where if you're Arthur Smith, you turn him loose. And I know that trusting Arthur Smith to be a rational coach has not worked out very well this year for Kyle Pitts.
You mean to use his best players? Yeah, no.
Yeah, I do think that that this is a good spot for a multi-touchdown game from Patterson.
Okay. And he had a multi-touchdown game 2 weeks ago in his return. So I'm not going to say that's that bold a call. But if he gets, 43 yards and 2 touchdowns, is that getting there? I guess it is. He's not that high priced. I just don't see him as like a 100+ total yards and 2 touchdowns guy at this point, just with how they play offense. But, hey, I've certainly been wrong before. John, is there anybody?
I was just going to say it would have to happen like in 1 or 2 plays. So one of those 2 touchdowns has to be long.
Agreed. And I know he's, I know we remember the kick return guy, but is he that guy off the knee, or is he just an old guy now that doesn't do that? I don't know. I'm with you. It could happen, but that's what it would have to be because he's not going to get your 25, touches, carries, etc. So, John, is there anybody we're forgetting about, or did you have a Jacobs take since you brought it up?
No, I didn't have a strong Jacobs take. Just he came off basically. He's David Montgomery in terms of value, and I knew that Phil loved David Montgomery, so I wanted him to opine on where he thought Josh Jacobs stood. I think the player pool is pretty limited, to be honest. I haven't narrowed it down yet. I typically narrow down on Saturdays, but I'm going to guess I'm going to have 10 or less running backs in my player pool for 150 lineups, which is pretty low. Guys that will be near the top of the list: Dameon, Ramondre, Alvin Kamara is coming off as strong. We'll see how his ownership trends into the weekend. They're pretty thin at running back. I heard today on my commute home that they signed David Johnson to the practice squad. So
David Johnson.
He's
still around.
Yeah,
he was with. I think he was with them on a practice squad situation in the preseason too. I think. But wow, that's wild stuff.
Yeah, so that tells you how rough things are there. And the thing about Kamara, recently it's been more around what Taysom Hill does to vulture him near in the red zone. But over the years, the knock on Kamara has been, they bring in somebody else, they split time, etc. But if they're getting thin, he's got some upside, and we've seen 5 touchdown upside from that guy. So long story short, I think it's a thin position. Don't get fancy here. You probably got 8 to 10 guys who are viable for tournaments. You got 3, maybe 4 guys who are viable for cash games, and then eliminate the rest. I won't even mention that guy in Pittsburgh's name this week, even though he almost got me 100 yards last week.
Almost. But speaking of 5 touchdown upside, there's a player playing against Pittsburgh this week that in his last game scored 5 touchdowns, and that's Joe Mixon. Is there any thought there? I don't think it's cash game necessarily because the game environment stinks, but what if they just pound the Steelers and it's all Joe Mixon all the time? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, he's one of the guys in that player pool I was describing. Yeah. He's probably my 5th or 6th choice.
Okay.
Out of the 10, so somewhere in that middle of that pack.
Okay. I just didn't want to overlook. Sometimes in DFS, right? We're so weekly, and someone has a bye week, and we forget what happened 2 weeks ago, but we know what happened against a weak team 2 weeks ago, and the Steelers are sadly a weak team at this point. All right. Any other running back thoughts, guys, or are we good to go?
I'm curious where you guys would put Jonathan Taylor. Do you think that he's in that same sphere with Barkley, Jacobs, Kamara, Mixon, or do we still need to see more coming off of the ankle?
I don't know that it's the ankle for me. It's what's he going to do when they're down, 13 to Philly.
Well, I think he's going to catch it because Naheem Hines is gone.
Deion Jackson should play again this week, though. I think
Deion Jackson is back. Okay, that would make a difference.
Yeah, so it's a stay tuned situation, but I think he's trending.
Plus, he can't score if Matt Ryan has 4 touchdowns.
Obviously. All right. Well, this is right where Devin would move us on. But I'd rather play Dalvin Cook for 200 more if I was going for some kind of elite running back upside there in a better game environment. But of course, percent rostered notwithstanding. All right, let's move on to wide receivers. Before we do, I just want to ask everybody, subscribe to our channel if you're not already, if you just came across us, or if you watch every week and you're not subscribed yet, then shame on you, and please do. Hit the bell, like our video, hit us in the comments. Guys, let's move to wide receivers. We've got some news. The biggest news, in fantasy football, potentially in the NFL. Pour one out for Cooper Kupp. My guy, ankle injury on the IR. Are we going to Allen Robinson? Are we going to Ben Skoranek in the slot? Are we thinking they're going to score 9 points in every game and just moving right on? Also, we have Jerry Jeudy in Denver with an ankle, left the game last week. Has not practiced yet this week. Nor has KJ Hamler, who's another receiver in Denver, and also Kendall Hinton. You'd think Kendall Hinton of COVID spot start quarterback fame 2 years ago did not practice today either. So a player named Jalen Virgil, who I've never heard of, is next man up, and he scored a long touchdown last week. So are we going to Jalen Virgil? We're probably not. But what are we doing in Denver? Is the answer just Cortland Sutton all the time, or none? And also for the Jets, Corey Davis, which has made Garrett Wilson a nice value after his hot start. He tapered off. He had a couple good games since. Corey Davis looks like he's going to miss again. Hasn't practiced yet this week. So that's the news. Any news striking your fancy, or just general thoughts? Let's start with Phil, since John started running backs. Go ahead, Phil.
Sure. I will start with cash games. Before I do that, to answer your question about Denver, you're totally ruining my tight end take.
Yeah. I was gonna get that.
I do think that's going to be the answer there for cash games, but starting with cash games at wide receiver, I've once again got Amon-Ra St. Brown on the top of the list. Last week I played him, and I mentioned on this show his massive target share since returning from injury. Last week it actually crept over 40% of the Lions' targets. You can't do better than that, and 7,200 is too cheap. I think that he is as close as it comes to like an auto click for me on this slate. I guess him and Fields were probably the first two names that I clicked. Ramondre a close third. Then in the middle range, because I do think that you need to be in the middle range with at least one of these wide receiver spots. Not usually a cash game guy because he doesn't fit the profile, but I like Terry McLaurin this week. Houston is another team like the Bears whose pass defense kind of looks better than it is because everybody could run on them. Saquon Barkley showed it last week, but McLaurin's salary at 5,900, it just doesn't reflect his improvement since Tyler Heineke joined the lineup. 18.3, 19.6, 10.6, and 23.8 DraftKings points are his finishes in the 4 games with Heineke. 8 targets in every one of those games. So the volume is there, so this isn't boom bust Terry McLaurin. And I think the matchup is fine. And then I think Phil, that does make him. You said he wasn't a cash game player profile as one. I think he does now, right? I mean, when you listed off these numbers in the 20s, I thought you were listing target share instead of fantasy points, and I would argue his target share is probably higher. I would assume. So, I mean, in the last 4 weeks, he does profile as that. So sorry to cut you off, but I agree. Yeah, that's okay, especially at 5,900. I think it's just totally a solid price for him. And then I think you got to go low with at least one wide receiver spot, and this is where it's going to be the hard part. I think like mid-low, you got Garrett Wilson. 2 games without Corey Davis in the lineup, and Wilson has been the only sure thing for the Jets. He went 6 for 118 and 7 for 92. The Patriots are a tough draw, but I don't see any projected volume anywhere else in the 4,900 range. If you go any lower than that, you're grasping at straws. I mean, do you feel good about Nico Collins at 4,100? Do you want to pretend you know what's going to happen with the Rams and play Ben Skoranek in Cooper Kupp's absence at 3,900? John mentioned Paris Campbell before. I have a pretty strong take there on Paris Campbell. I think he's going to be a really unsharp play this week. And the reason I think that is because my unsharp brain, when I was first filling out a DraftKings lineup without looking at any projections, I was like, oh, Paris Campbell's 4,300. He's got 31 targets in Matt Ryan's last 3 starts. I mean, that's the guy. That's who we're looking for. And then I looked at the projections, and I blend them from site to site, and it just doesn't project that way for Paris Campbell. So I have a feeling it's going to be a tough go for the entire Indianapolis offense there. While I like John's thought process on a cheap double stack, I don't see it this week with Paris Campbell.
Philly's coming in pissed off. Sorry, Joe.
Where do you have him? Where do you have him projected in your numbers, Phil?
Let's see. It is about 8 points.
Okay. Yeah, I've got him at 9.5. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 12% likely to hit GPP value, only 5% of rosters. So, the disparity there.
Here's why I'm worried, right? If me, without looking at projections, thought that he was an auto play, I'm worried that the rest of the folks out there in the field that don't pour over projections like we do are just going to click that button because he's coming off a big game and he's seen a lot of targets with Matt Ryan. Yeah. And I'm willing to bet that narrative is going to get out there this week. So
I've already started to hear it.
Yeah, I'm thinking that the roster percentage is going to be one of those that when you check at the end of the day on Sunday, you're going to be like, how is Paris Campbell 25% owned? Like, this doesn't make any sense.
If he's 25% owned, you should have exactly 0 shares of
25 seems like a lot, but it'll be
that
more
does
than
seem
5.
like a lot. But I'm saying
more than,
I think it could
17,
go
17,
8.
Yeah.
All right.
So Phil mentioned St.
So Phil mentioned St. Brown. Who else did you mention now that Ryan's gone out?
Sure. So for cash games, it was St. Brown, Mclaurin, Garrett Wilson are the 3 guys that I'm really trying to play so that I could avoid some of these really thin players on the fringe.
All right. Ryan,
Yep, I'm here.
You cut yourself off, so we summarized for you.
The absolute worst. Sorry, folks. John, I'd love to reset the router, but then the whole show goes kaput. So you teased GPP plays earlier. Did you have any other cash plays you wanted to inject before that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the Amon-Ra, but I really like Stefon Diggs this week, 8,300. He's $1,000 more, but the team total there is the highest on the board, 28.5 points. Detroit is 21. So there's a fairly significant difference. We know that Josh Allen likes to go there. And that's not to take anything away from Amon-Ra. He's gotten his targets for sure. But if you're making me decide, I might try to get up to Stefon Diggs over Amon-Ra. I mean, if you can get them both, even better. And I think you can, by the way. What the hell? Let's talk about it now.
In cash?
Cash and GPPs. You're going to see, we saw it last week for sure. And this week, I think you're going to see it again. These sites, both of them actually, are tempting you to put a tight end into your flex position.
Yeah.
And I think you can do it again this week if you want for both cash as well as GPP. GPP, I think last week was the first time I've ever allowed an optimizer or a lineup builder. I don't use an optimizer, but a lineup builder to insert tight ends into the flex position.
Okay.
Simply because it's been so tight from a salary perspective. I think you can do it again this week. So that's the likely way to get both Diggs and Amon-Ra into your lineup.
And here's where I channel my inner Devin and say, like, are we done with the Tyler Higbee stuff yet, or should we just wait till the tight end section before we talk about Tyler Higbee, or what's going on?
We'll wait till we get there.
It's obviously going to be Tyler Higbee and Greg Dulcich, as Phil teased earlier. Yeah. All right, so I've done a poor job of recapping and a poor job of Wi-Fi. Only one of those are within my control, but cash games, we're looking at St. Brown, Mclaurin, Wilson from Phil. John says insert Diggs and play cheap tight ends and grit your teeth and enjoy it. I think that's fine. And then, of course, John seems to be on Paris Campbell, but we're going to check that percent rostered as we look into Sunday. Is there anybody else we're missing, guys? So just here at Football Guys, if you look at our optimizer, Justin Freeman, whose projections I really respect, has Noah Brown from Dallas, 3,700, as 9 points at 3,700, as relatively in play. What do you guys think of that? We have Donovan Peoples-Jones, who I know we discussed or you guys discussed last week. I was on team DPJ over team Zay Jones because I don't like Zay Jones and I think he's not good. But Donovan Peoples-Jones went up to 4,600 this week. Anybody else in that range that we're willing to go to pivot off of Garrett Wilson or to just do anything else to save us some money?
It's pretty thin down there. Let me see. The best play I have down there is, it's thin, guys. Garrett Wilson's the strongest play south of 5,000. After that, Nico Collins at 4,100. He's going up against Washington. I don't know. If you make me go down that low, I'm going to go with Skorodnik. Possession receiver. He's maybe a better NFL version of Zay Jones. He's going to get those short, 8-yard passes, 6 of those. And, the question is whether Walford will hit him or not. Is Stafford back?
He may be back. I forgot to cover that. He did have a full practice today. So Stafford will be back. Or should be back. I apologize.
That is still worth touching on, though. So the obvious thing I think for the Rams to do would be to put Skoranek in the slot because he certainly doesn't profile as an outside receiver, whereas Robinson and Van Jefferson both do. Do we think that there's a remote chance that McVay gets creative and at least starts running Robinson a little bit more in the slot, like a couple of snaps? Like,
he hasn't been creative since 2019.
If Robinson is just running wind sprints outside, why can't Skoranek? That's what I would say to that.
Fair point.
So the other guy I think we're not mentioning and overlooking, just again, like smack in the middle of the price range, is Courtland Sutton in Denver. Sutton had 11 targets last week, and of course Jerry Jeudy left the game, which maybe inflated that, but Jerry Jeudy's probably not playing in this game. I also listed KJ Hamler, Kendall Hinton are also likely not to play this game. Not that they should be, incredible threats to Sutton anyways. So this Denver offense is obviously broken. There's no doubt about that. But if you're going to give me, 10, 12 targets from a talented guy, first round pick for 6,000 against Vegas, who just stinks, I'll entertain it. Any thoughts?
Those guys are both on my list, by the way. I just didn't get there, but
cool.
I think for GPPs, they're both solid.
Awesome. All right. Well, I talked about moving on to tight ends roughly, 10 minutes ago. So let's finally do it. Let's start off at tight ends. And Phil, you teased it earlier, but go ahead and give us your logic. Actually, before you do that, let's talk injuries here. The biggest name at tight end is Mark Andrews with his shoulder coming off the bye for the Ravens. He didn't play week prior, didn't practice Wednesday, limited today, which is Thursday, but was not available to the media either day. So keep an eye on that in terms of Mark Andrews' availability. I think Isaiah likely, becomes the guy after that, of course. Gerald Everett, actually, that's not on the main slate, so excuse me for that. Cole Kmet, limited practice Thursday after not practicing Wednesday. Could be a load management thing there. And then David Njoku, Devin's boy, shout out to Devin, looks like arrow is pointing up to return with a limited practice today, Thursday. So keep an eye on him. But, I don't know if any of those guys are on Phil or John's radars. So tell us, Phil, why Greg Dulcich is the play.
Well, you need a cheap tight end in cash games, especially if you want a prayer of putting Stefon Diggs in there, which I was just trying to do, and I was having a hard time doing
it's
it
tough
with two cheap tight ends. But Dulcich disappointed last week, but the underlying stats were definitely there. He dominated snaps and routes run, 20% target share, 27% air yard share. Russell Wilson actually missed him on what could have been a big play, and he was so cheap. I think last week was 3,400 maybe or something like that, where that one play would have just about gotten him there and kind of shifted the narrative from, he busted to he was fine. But you've said it a couple times now. No Judy, no Hamler, no Hinton. You got Montrell Washington and Jalen Virgil competing for targets behind Cortland Sutton. And he's an explosive athlete. So 20 DraftKings points is not out of reach. I don't even know who else to put in a cash game lineup at tight end. So we'll see if maybe one of you guys has another one. And then in GPPs, if Mark Andrews is active and all signs are pointing up for him by the weekend, Kelsey's not on this slate. Kittle's not on the slate. Waller is out, and he wasn't really a thing this year. Every Kyle Pitts air yard counts as like 25% of a normal air yard. So you can't even play that game with him. There's just no tight ends that could compete with Andrews' upside if he's active. So if he's in, then I'm in on Andrews for tournaments. We still haven't seen him since Rashad Bateman went out. So he's going to be the number 1, 2, and 3 target in that offense. So I'm here for it, especially because nobody's spending up a tight end this week in tournaments. I see him as a really strong play.
I agree. And I think, circling back to quarterbacks, you guys mentioned Jackson, and
I don't know.
Phil, it's not you this year.
I got that good Florida internet now. Oh, actually, what's up with his then? He's in Florida too.
It's Orlando. He's got a good looking face though. Look at him.
Sure does.
All
so
right.
What do you think about cash games? Is there anybody besides Dulcich that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Dulcich.
Yeah.
He's the top guy for me. I mean, we've got to talk about the other guy too.
Higby.
Higby
I'm back for Higby.
By 0.01 points is higher rated than Dulcich, but I'll go with the fella from Denver over Higby right now. I think simply because he's going to be twice as popular or thereabouts as Higby. And, the thing about tight ends is they're so all over the place that, if you go with Higby and Dulcich scores a touchdown and Higby doesn't, it really puts you against the 8 ball. I'd rather beat my opponents at a position that I feel more strongly about. And this isn't one that I feel strong. So I think Dulcich is the guy at tight end. For GPPs though, I'm going to keep going back to the well with these guys who have historically shown me they have upside. Higby and Pitts are both those guys. They're both, especially Pitts. I mean, Pitts, I was trying to pull it up before the segment. I can't find it anywhere, but Pitts' target share in air yards it's got to be off the charts. I mean, if it's not 30%, I'd be surprised. And it's just awful quarterback play. I think I read somewhere this week that he's had 52% of his passes are actually catchable, which is just a reflection of Marcus Mariota more so than anything. That said, the volume is there. They've got the third highest implied team total in the entire slate. And quite frankly, he's probably the most talented receiver on that offense. I mean, no offense to Drake London, but I just feel like he's a better overall player. Those are the guys that are high on my list. I think this is a position though that you can go down the list. I mean, I talked about how thin running back is. I feel like there's more players here just because of the pricing that DraftKings has put forth. I think Dawson Knox is in play. Dalton Schultz is in play. You heard Phil talk about Mark Andrews. Foster Moreau is probably still in play here. TJ Hawkinson has 2 touchdown upside. This is a good position. And, this is where you can differentiate yourself and do some different things. It's why I said you can play this position in the flex this week.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Hawkinson, John. He has 16 receptions since coming to the Vikings. He's been there for, a week and a half. It's crazy. So they clearly love him there. And what I was saying earlier before another freeze was if you're playing Andrews, you're playing Jackson. If you're playing Jackson, you're playing Andrews. There's just no other way to do it. It feels like. Because the way the Ravens played that game Monday night in New Orleans, now granted the Saints didn't make them play it any other way, but the way they played it, I don't think Jackson threw more than 20 times in the game, or certainly not too much more if it was above 20. So let's transition. I think we're good at tight end. And John, great observations there on just more guys, just because of not because of raw points. I think we sometimes mix projections and points and forget about price a little bit, but just the way the position is priced gives you more options. And then the volatility and touchdown dependence of it, of course, does too. So let's move on to defenses. We mentioned the Ravens earlier in the show. You'll pay a pretty penny, but that seems to be the highest projected. But what are you guys doing in the context of your lineup and not just taking the highest projected defense here, because they're also one of the higher priced ones? Phil, get us started.
For me, it's the Steelers at 2,300. Joe Burrow has been sacked 32 times this year, which is the 4th most in the league. That includes 7 times by the Steelers back in week 1. And Ryan, you're the Steelers expert, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that defense, I mentioned it last week, is getting healthier. Obviously, TJ Watt is the big name, but DeMonte Casey finally played last week at safety and had an interception in his first appearance. Minka Fitzpatrick had a bout with appendicitis last week. He should be back, I think. So that defense is kind of rounding into Steelers, or something that more closely resembles the Steelers defense that we're used to. And 2,300 for me, especially in this matchup, I think that's more of like the injured Steelers defense price. So I think there's definitely an advantage to be gained there. If you somehow have an extra 700, I would say get up to the Saints. Yeah. You got the Rams, who have that atrocious offensive line. They turn the ball over a lot. They give up a lot of sacks. And now they don't have the only single solitary thing that was working in that offense in Cooper Kupp. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah, Phil, great calls on the Steelers, and I will relish in the opportunity to say something positive about the team. TJ Watt is the engine of the team. He was back last week. They only gave up 10 points. New Orleans only ran, I think, sub 50 plays, and the Steelers actually ran above 70 plays, which is just wild to think of, given those two offenses. But yes, Fitzpatrick is back at practice, even like 5 days after an appendectomy, which is also pretty wild. But even if he doesn't play, I still, TJ Watt is the engine. I think it's a good call, and they are at home. Only 2,300 at home. So, why not against a poor offensive line and a quarterback that likes to hold the ball? John, any other contributions on the defense side?
I mean, we've come full circle. Phil mentioned 2 quarterbacks at the top of the show that were on my list, and he mentioned the 2 defenses that were also on my list for the same reasons. I mean, 2,300 for the Steelers. They're going to give up probably 24, 28 points. But at 2,300, they need to get you an INT, 3 or 4 sacks, and maybe fall on a fumble, and they've gotten you that 3x value at the most volatile position. Is talking about tight ends. So that's the way I'd be going for cash. And then the other cash one I had was the Saints going up against a Rams offense that hasn't shown anybody much this year. As far as GPPs, I do think there's value in, no pun intended, going expensive at the position. So the Ravens going up against Carolina, we talked about how the Carolina Panthers have the lowest implied team total on the board for the entire year. They're 4,000, and I think they're going to go under owns. I've got them at 2.5% right now. This is a type of scenario where it could get ugly, and then you're just going to see some, I don't know, Baker Mayfield or whoever the heck it is down there now, just doing Baker Mayfield-ish stuff. And a pick 6 would not be surprising. In fact, 2 wouldn't be surprising. So I kind of like the idea of paying up to be contrarian there. And then the last one, in the same game that we've already mentioned for cash games, the Rams, they have a pretty good, defense, right? I mean, they've got a lot of star players led by Aaron Donald. They got Jalen Ramsey there, and they're going up against Andy Dalton. Don't look past it. $2,900. I think that's a really sneaky GPP play, because last I looked, they're only going to be on 6% of lineups, and that's too little.
That's one I hadn't thought of. It's kind of right in the middle. Phil, you had something, it looks like.
Yeah, I was just going to share my notes because I had the Rams in my GPP plays too, and it says this Andy Dalton thing needs to end. So that was my contribution there. But that could absolutely be a slog of a game that's dominated by defense on both ends and defensive scoring. The only other defense that I have for GPPs strictly is the Browns. Josh Allen has thrown exactly 2 interceptions in each of his last 3 games. He's got the bum elbow that might be contributing to that over the last couple. And obviously nobody wants to play the defense that's facing Josh Allen in a dome. But the Browns are 2,300 on DraftKings. That's cheap enough to try it. And I don't think that anybody's going to be on them.
Yeah, I thought you were going to go with Patriots actually hosting the Jets and our boy Zach Wilson. But
what are they, like 6,000, 7,000?
Yeah, 3,700. So
okay.
point made, despite your exaggeration, which I know it was. So the John, that's a great call on the Rams. I wasn't thinking it is right between, right? You got your Ravens at 4,000, your Steelers, your Browns even at 2,300, and then nobody kind of settles in that middle layer, it feels like. So good call there. The irony there is also that we'd kind of be targeting the Saints if Jameis Winston was still the quarterback too, right? Mm-hmm. But so either way, we're targeting the Saints. Guys, that's really good on defense and all the other positions. Let's move on to final thoughts. I mean, it's an interesting week. Is there a stack that you haven't mentioned here? Is there just a thought on, sometimes we have these studs and duds weeks, and this is not one of those. Is there a thought on how these weeks tend to work? And any insight, Phil, why don't you give us a couple extra thoughts, if you have any, or you can do the Devin move and just say we're good and let's get out of here.
No, so stack that we haven't really talked about in the vein of John's wide receiver ownership, informing his quarterback ownership. I think that if I'm going to do a cheap double stack in tournaments, rather than looking at Matt Ryan, I'd look at Taylor Heineke and hope that for once all of the scoring comes through the air against Houston. So you could obviously pair him with McLaurin. And then really any other wide receiver there who might be in line to score a touchdown. But as far as like a zoomed out thought on this slate, I don't know if I have one. I mean, GPPs are like breaking my brain this year. I know that John feels the same way, probably more so than I do. The strategies that we've used in the past have not been working for several weeks in a row, and it seems like an extended lull. So if you're feeling that out there, just know that we feel it too. And that is kind of the life of a tournament player, is that sometimes when you spin that roulette wheel, black is going to keep coming out, no matter how many times that you think red is coming next. And I think that's kind of where we're at. Obviously, there are some contributing factors to what's been going on, but I'm thinking we shouldn't be throwing years and years of what's worked out the window for what's been going on the last couple weeks. So hopefully we get back to normal, which for GPP players is not normal, right? We're looking to kind of harness an outlier. So hopefully we got some of those outliers right this week and we get back on the winning track.
Sounds good. John, any thoughts from you?
Well, first, from Phil's lips to God's ears, I hope. But maybe a bit of lineup building advice for folks who are in GPPs. We always talk about double stacks with run backs, but what we don't talk about are secondary stacks or secondary correlations. The more correlated your lineups can be in GPP, the more likely you are to finish in that top 5%. The goal in GPP should never be to cash. Of course, that's nice, but really what you're going for is that upside. And we structure this show in such a way that we talk about Vegas at the very top to kind of give you an idea of the games that you want to think about stacking. We talk about stacking throughout, but one of the things I think there's only so much you can cover, but secondary stacks are something that I build into my lineup builders, where I'll do typically a double stack. That is a quarterback with a receiver and either a running back or a second receiver. And then I'll run that back on the other side with another player from the opposite team. But in about half of my lineups, I also run it back with a secondary stack. And that is another game, a separate game where there's a player from each side, or and I've seen some recent data to this end, and it's worked really well this year. I think in 10 weeks, the winning lineup on FanDuel for their big tournament, their I don't know what they call it, Sunday Million, has been a wide receiver and a running back on the same squad on that run back. So just be thinking about that, especially for those of you already building. I know that, I talk a lot about mass multi-entry, 150 lineups in my player pool, etc. But I started off doing the same thing that I think a lot of our listeners do, and that is a couple lineups a week. Just make sure you're building that correlation in, and it doesn't stop at that double stack with a run back. Do the secondary stack, and don't be afraid to take two guys from the same team, because if you get the right game that you stacked, and then you get the right team on the other side that scores 30 points, you're in a great spot to finish in the top 5%.
Agreed. Great insight there. We always talk about that one direct stack, but you kind of need that secondary one as well from another game. So great point. Before I freeze again, I'm going to say Gabe Davis, 100 yards and a touchdown this week. It's Gabe Davis week. It's due. And on that note, please check out our content at footballguys.com and footballguys.com/DFS, where John contributes the Vegas value chart, among other things. And shout out to Devin. He contributes very much there as well. And the aforementioned lineup optimizer that I talked about earlier on the show is available there too. And so with that, guys, let's bring the show to a close. So on behalf of Phil, who thank you for filling in for Devin tonight, and on behalf of John, I'm Ryan Hester. I want to say thank you for joining us, and thanks for being a football guy.